disaster which devastated the tiny Cornish communities in West Penwith from where they came. When a man engine failed at Levant, wives were widowed, children left fatherless, and colleagues stunned and shocked by the enormity of the accident. News of the tragedy rocked both the industry and the country and ensured that the name of Levant would remain forever in the history books. Sadly, the mine never really recovered from the ordeal, and by 1930 the engines had ground to a halt and the shafts lay silent. On Friday, Levant's history will take another twist when an announcement is made concerning the engine house which stands perilously close to the cliff edge. In the run-up to this, Tamsin is touring the Levant site with former mining engineer Milton Thomas, who's also an active member of the Trevithick Society. Today, they look back to the Levant tragedy.
In many ways, Levant mine was a tragic mine. Many sad things happened here. The worst being the mining disaster for which Levant became famous, both in mining terms and in Cornwall's history. And we're actually standing now on top of the man engine shaft, which was the scene of the very saddest story of Levant's history.
That's right. The accident in this man engine shaft came about through a fracture of a strapping plate which connected the vertical man engine rod to the angle bob. It caused a series of unbalanced forces to operate on the other strapping plate at the opposite side of the beam. Consequently, that plate also fractured, and the rod, instead of falling vertically, was forced into an inclined position. If it had fallen vertically, the safety devices would have operated on the catch wings, and the disaster might have not been to such a great an extent. The catch wings are timbers placed across the shaft, which would hold the man engine rod with its bulky stops attached to the back end man engine rod. And in the event of it falling more than 12 feet, these catch wings would become operative. Now, what happened was the falling rod eventually struck the bottom of the shaft at a depth of 266 fathoms. The total weight of the man engine rod, with its complement of 150 men, was something in excess of 370 tons. Of course, this 370 tons was balanced by the balance bobs on surface and down in the man engine shaft itself, there being 5 of them, 2 at surface and 3 underground. The reverberation caused when the man engine rod thumped onto the bottom of the shaft sent a reverberation upwards, and unfortunately, above the 70 fathom level, the rod fractured into many pieces. Immediately the rod fractured into many pieces. It pulled down with it, of course, the balance bob above it, filled with its timber and stone, and all the associated ironwork, the ladderways in the shaft, the guides in the shaft, and all the associated timber came cascading down on the men who were standing on the rod. This happened at 10 to 3 on Monday, October the 20th, 1919, and it wasn't until the following Saturday that the last deceased was removed. But fortunately, the falling debris caused a natural chokage at the 70 fathom level, and below the 70 fathom level there were no fatalities. The miners got off the rod, scrambled to their nearest station, and found their way back to pump shaft, where they climbed to surface with the ladders in pump shaft.
And this shaft we're standing on has never been opened or looked at since, has it?
The shaft has never been opened up for access to the mine. Consequently, the mine wanted to continue its working life, and it was then necessary to build another approach for the miners, and this was done by the provision of the cliff path, which passes the engine house, and it winds its way around the cliff face, and it eventually leads into an adit into skip shaft. The miners would then descend to their working places, climbing the ladders. Now, the greatest depth of Levant mine was 350 fathoms, and the workings extended to a mile under the sea. This meant that it would be impossible in a working day for a man to walk a mile under the sea and then to climb down the 350 fathoms, do some work, and return. So Levant Mine from 1919 to 1930 was forced to rework some of the previously worked loads which they had done in the earlier days of the Levant Mine.
A tough old time for the miners who had to walk that path, because they'd, after the mine engine disaster, would walk in all the elements to the shaft, work in a warm, dry mine, and then have to come out for what could have been a cold and wet walk back up to the changing rooms. And it must have just been awful to go from one extreme to the other.
Yes. These arduous working conditions had, of course, an adverse effect upon the health of the miners.
Would it be fair to say that this man shaft we're standing on now is a grave almost, because there are still remains down there?
Yes. The area in which we're standing, it has many unpleasant memories for people still associated with the man-engine disaster, their relatives living in Pendeen and Trewellard. And on many occasions we've had the grandsons of the deceased coming down to us in the engine house and saying, it was my grandfather that was killed in the disaster, and where is the actual disaster? Although the man-engine shaft has now been filled in, the filling material will be eventually removed by Givor, and I am quite sure that in the not-too-distant future, we shall surround the area with a low-built Cornish hedge, and in the Cornish hedge we shall place a commemorative plaque to the deceased, so that the relatives will be able to come and say, well, this is where so-and-so died in the disaster of 1919.
Well, tomorrow we're going to be looking at the engine house, but before that, there is an area nearby where the relatives waited when the disaster first happened, isn't there? Perhaps we should go and visit that.
Yes. When we go down past the pump house, you will, just beside the stack associated with the pump house, there is this area where the ladies were assembled during the days of the disaster, and it was their duty to identify the remains which were brought up skip shaft by the beam winding engine. Now these remains, of course, were in a very mangled and terrible state, and you can just imagine the most difficult job it was for wives and sweethearts to identify the remains of their deceased.
Lifting and hauling techniques, how to rescue people from basements, improvised lifting equipment.
Since then, the site has stood in silence, but crumbling tribute to the men, women and children who grasped a meagre living from the mine's activities. Fortunately, the Levant engine has withstood the test of time, as has the building in which it's housed. So it's not surprising that the Trevithick Society have set out to restore the machinery to a very high standard. Tomorrow, an announcement will be made about a special appeal which is tied into the restoration, but today we complete a tour of the Levant site with Tamsin and Milton Thomas, who's a former mining engineer.
This is our final day touring the Levant mine area, and we've come inside to the engine house, which has been restored by the Trevithick Society and which is owned by the National Trust. And I have with me Milton, as usual. Milton, what was this engine all about? What was this for?
This is a Cornish rotative beam engine. The diameter of the cylinder is 27 inches, its stroke is 4 feet, and its object was to raise the ore from skip shaft down from the mine at 278 fathoms. In its working day, it was hoisting 1-ton skips at approximately 400 feet per minute from a depth of 278 fathoms. This took about 4 to 5 minutes, and then, of course, the material in the skips would be dumped and go away to the stamps.
Now, what made the Trevithick Society decide to work on the engine and get it back into working condition?
We thought that this engine, in its state that we found it, was worth preserving. So we laboriously cleaned off all the accumulated rust and the gunge which had accumulated over approximately 60 years of idleness. And then we gave it 3 or 4 coats of paint. And in its stationary condition, the engine looked very nice. About 1 year later, myself and another fellow from London called Tom Barr, we were down here looking at our work, and it was suggested amongst us that the best way in which we could preserve this engine was to strip it down and to get it back to its working state. So from that particular day, we have now spent approximately 4 to 5 years in stripping down all the rusted parts of this engine, cleaning them, reassembling them, and refurbishing the engine so that it is now almost ready to put under compressed air.
You were well surprised, weren't you, at what good condition each piece of the machinery was in when you first started the job as well?
Yes, we found that several parts of the machine needed only basically some elementary cleaning and followed by a little oiling. But there are other parts that were rusted solid, and so we had to apply heat and brute force, and we eventually freed all those stuck places, cleaned them up, reassembled them, and now, instead of the silence which you can hear in the engine house, we can now hear the engine in its working state.
And so we hear the engine moving in the background. This must have been very exciting to get to this position.
Yes, when you consider that the moving parts were completely rusted, there was no movement in them, and now by many hours of hard work and persistent cleaning, you can see that we have the engine in motion.
Well, we'd better shout down to Will, hadn't we, to stop?
Right, Will, if you'll stop the machine.
Now, of course, there's a lot more to happen here because ultimately the aim is to have the engine working for people to come down and see. And tomorrow an announcement will be made about the next step in that. But you've been doing some work outside the engine house which will prepare the ground, haven't you?
That's right. We have, in association with the restoration of this machine, a Cornish boiler, which is at the moment located at Geaver. And next week, that Cornish boiler will be moved from Geaver down to Levant. But before we can site the boiler into its final position, we've had to excavate the old boiler site.
Shall we take a walk then, Milton, and go out and have a look at the excavation ourselves? Right, we'll make our way outside.
Sing out loud and strong, sing the song of Cornwall. This land where over golden sands the salt sea breezes blow. This land of bliss and most, of streams and granite coast. This land of endless summer hours, where God's wildflowers grow.
Well, we've come outside now, just outside the engine house to one side where the pit's been built in which you're going to put the boiler.
Over to my left, there is a whole series of seating blocks which accommodated the boiler when Levant Mine was working. We shall eventually remove those seating blocks, and in their place we shall put the seating blocks associated with the boiler, which is now at Geaver. Tomorrow, the boiler which is at Geaver will be transported to Levant by a steam engine, and it will take up a position somewhere about 200 feet above us, and eventually it will be my duty to bring this Cornish boiler from that site and locate it just here where we're standing. In front of me there is a coal chute, which of course was necessary in order to get the coal from the coal dump just above us down into the boiler house where the engine man would feed this coal into the boiler to convert the water into steam. Of course, associated with the combustion of coal, there would be a quantity of ashes, and these ashes would have to be removed daily. And so it was the duty of the engine man to rake out the ashes from the boiler and to get rid of them. Just behind me, there is a tunnel which leads to a zone. So the ashes will be taken out by a wheelbarrow and dumped into the zone. In association with this tunnel, there is a corbelled archway, which was necessary because just in front of the corbelled archway, there is a doorway. And the doorway would have to be open at all times in order that the Cornish boiler could receive the requisite quantity of air.
Well, more news on Radio Cornwall tomorrow about the mine and the boiler and this very pit that we're standing in. But I get the impression, Milton, that you and all your colleagues have really enjoyed the work that you've already put in to Levant Engine and its hard work, and are looking forward to all the work you've got ahead of you.
For the last 4 or 5 years, we've had a dedicated band of workers who have consistently come down on Fridays to work on this engine. And we have enjoyed ourselves in so doing, and we're always looking forward to coming down on Fridays to continue with the work.
Why do you enjoy it so much, though?
Well, the reason why I enjoy it is, I must say, I feel great pleasure in having to get my hands and my brains working so that we can get a machine that is stationary into its working condition, and the pleasure and education that is going to give to the thousands of visitors which will in a short time be flooding into this engine house and admiring the machine in motion.
And do you think that Levant is enjoying being brought back to life?
I'm quite sure that the spiritual influences which are present in this area are looking upon us in a benign manner, and although they are invisible, I would say that they are nodding their head in approval.
In every Cornish heart still lives the song of Cornwall. Tintagel down to Marazine, Lanson to Lantern. Sing the song of Cornwall. This land where over golden sands the salty breezes blow. This land of cliffs and moors, of streams and granite towers. This land of windless summer hours, where God's love flowers grow. The song of Cornwall.
Stirring stuff. Mavagizzy Male Choir there with their Song of Cornwall, bringing our tour of the Levant mine site to an end.
Where a special project is being launched by the Trevithick Society and the National Trust to breathe new life into the mine workings down there.
Well, Rebecca, here we are again back at Levant. Lots of people have been turning up. They want to see the boiler house, the engine house, which the National Trust have restored, and of course the beam engine itself. There's been a tremendous amount of work on the beam engine, and the man who's been leading that is Milton Thomas, who's with me now. And I believe, Milton, the correct way of describing you is head of the greasy gang, isn't that right?
That is quite correct. Now, this name was given to me because the work involved in the restoration of this engine entailed a terrific amount of removal of adherent grease to the machinery. And after we had de-rusted the machine, reset it, it was necessary once more to put on a fair amount of protective grease to keep the seawater away from the parts which we had previously cleaned. One day, one of our members came down here and saw us in this state of hands dirty, face dirty, and covered in grease, and they said, well, we shall have to call you the Greasy Gang. And from that day, about 4 years ago, that has stuck with us.
What a name to live down. Now, Milton, tell me, how many man hours have gone in to restoring the beam engine?
Offhand, I would say at least 15 to 20,000 man hours have been spent in the last 4 or 5 years, given to us by a dedicated band of workers from the Trevithick Society, although I must say that the number of the dedicated workers has not exceeded 5. But on Fridays and Saturdays, 4 or 5 of us have continually come down here, and we've given our time and our expertise in the restoration of this magnificent Levant beam winding engine.
Well, Rebecca, in the background, We can hear the old and the new. We can hear a helicopter flying by. And of course, just about 10 15 feet from me, Leonard Hoskins' traction engine, which has brought the Levant boiler down from Giva, just down the road to Levant today. Now, I'm also got here with me Nick Johnson, who's the director of the Cornwall Archaeological Unit. Nick, when all this is up and running, this display, what sort of an impact is it going to have from an interpretive point of view to people coming to the area?
Oh, it's going to have a great impact. I think largely by looking at it in a wider area, it acts as a focal point to see live steam amongst the cliff-top ruins, and we very much hope that people will use this as a setting off point for walking along the cliffs, going back up to Giva and so on, in order to try to understand not only what all the buildings mean and what their functions were, but also to get some sense of work 100 years ago in this difficult but magnificent area.
Well, actually, it's going to be, the steam's going to be coming from a modern steam plant, isn't it?
Well, we have to move with the times. We managed to rescue a really excellent boiler from the China Clay District in order to bring it down here. But obviously, it's a very old engine, and it's just great to see it back in steam, even though it is a modern compressed plant.
Right. Well, Ian Hope is chairman of Penwith's Tourism Committee, and he's here too today. Ian, how important do you think the launch of this appeal is going to be to the future of tourism in West Cornwall?
I think it's very important. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I'd like to congratulate the Trevithick Society and the National Trust for all their efforts and the magnificent work that's been put in over the years to do this. I feel, as has been said, this is a lovely setting. It's a beautiful setting. It's part of our old heritage. It's wonderful for visitors to come and see exactly what was going on in Cornwall all those years ago. And not only for visitors, it's also great for our local youngsters to be able to be brought here. And in this setting, among the ruins, on the cliffs, I can't think of a better place to have steam again.
I think it can be fairly said that these days we're becoming heritage crazy, maybe paying more attention to the past and the present and the future. I think there's a risk of doing this, particularly with the mining industry, which is in such a parlous state here in West Cornwall.
No, I don't think so. Obviously, all of the relics and all of the ruins cannot be restored. But this is the centre, it was the centre of the mining in this area in the last couple of centuries, and I think it's great that it's going to be preserved, that live steam will once again be seen on these cliffs amongst this setting.
Well, Rebecca, that's it. The appeal is being launched in just a few moments' time, and then the money hopefully will be coming in to enable the National Trust to work with the Trevithick Society and get the beam engine not quite running itself, but certainly looking very much the part that it did in the golden age of tin mining in West Cornwall, when Levant was a name to be reckoned with. So from me, this is Stephen Strong reporting from Levant at Pendeen.
Some splendid chugging noises going on in the background. Stephen Strong.
Kens ti the vos gan sanguins, tein the vers thein ragol, tein the vers thein ragol. Praise you, Golia souls, mos in hands tremaki, tein the vase they silan, tein the vase they silan, war froslan wan nos, avim div de waitha, pen the vase they nevo, pen the vase they nevo, be thens do unto, lemon praise you more. praise you, Golia sons, praise you, Golia.